Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck tech for you, but before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers and every single click counts. And today's deck tech is going to be centered around Aeve Progenitor Ooze. For 2 colorless and 3 green, it's a legendary creature Ooze 2/2 with Storm. When you cast a spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. Copies become tokens. Aeve Progenitor Ooze isn't legendary if it's a token, and Aeve enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other Ooze you control. So the reason for this deck tech is that I'd been holding out for an Ooze tribal deck for a while, and the new card, Slime Against Humanity from Murders at Karlov Manor, really pushed me over the edge. But first, a quick disclaimer, there aren't that many copies of Slime Against Humanity in this deck, and the reason for that is that this is mostly an Ooze tribal deck. And the cool thing about Slime Against Humanity is that unlike other similar cards from the past of this type, it doesn't only count itself, it also counts other slime cards that you have in graveyard or in exile, so we're still going to get all the benefit by running a package of Ooze Tribal, even though we're only running, I think, 8 Slime Against Humanity cards. The other thing to mention is that even though Aeve can be built as a Storm Commander, that's not really what we're doing here. We do have a couple of cheap spells, so we can often get it out with a Storm count of 2 or 3, but oftentimes it's just going to be cast by itself, and it's still going to get a pretty huge buff because we're playing a bunch of Oozes. So with those disclaimers out of the way, let's get started, and we're starting off with Acidic Slime. This is a classic Ooze card. It used to be very good in Commander when Commander first started out, but these days it's usually a bit weaker. However, since it fits in with our theme, it's in. Arbor Elf, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, and Llanowar Elves all do the same thing. They're basically mana rocks in this deck. The reason we've included these over other stuff like Rampant Growth or other sorts of ramp is that we want our spells to be as cheap as possible so that we can later on chain them into a big Aeve if we have them in hand. So in that way they become useful later in the game, which is nice. Beast Whisperer is going to work well because even though we are running Slime Against Humanity, we still have 39 creatures in the deck. Biogenic Ooze is a really strong Ooze. It comes with 2 bodies right off the bat, and then it puts a +1/+1 counter on all of our Oozes at the end of turn, which is great. It even gives us a nice mana sink to make more Oozes late game. Bio-Waste Blob is a really cool card that could honestly see play outside of Ooze decks, I think. It just basically multiplies itself and gets bigger and bigger. At the very least, by your next upkeep, you're going to have 2/2/2s, which is fine. And of course, it's exponential, so the more the turns go on, the more this starts multiplying, and it gets harder and harder to deal with. Bloodline Pretender works very well with all of our Oozes, and it even synergizes with Slime Against Humanity. And seeing as we have a little bit of a counter sub-theme in the deck, this is great. Chameleon Colossus looks like an Ooze, which is awesome, and it has protection against black, which comes up very, very often. It can even just win the game out of nowhere, sometimes by swinging in for a huge chunk of damage. Consuming Blob is basically a bit like Tarmogoyf. It's going to have flexible power and toughness depending on the stuff that's in our graveyard, and it copies itself at the end of each turn, which is great for our go wide strategy. Corrosive Ooze is a cheap Ooze, and there's not that many of those, and it also really puts the brakes on any kind of Voltron strategy, since they're probably not going to come at you when you have this in play. Defiler of Vigor makes our stuff cheaper, which can allow for some really explosive plays, and it also buffs our entire board whenever we play a permanent. Eternal Witness is a classic card in Commander that's going to allow us to rebuy one of our pieces that have hit the graveyard. Experiment 1 is a card I love from back in the day. If you get this out early, it can actually be an absolute pain to deal with because you can just keep regenerating it and then keep evolving it because of that. Gluttonous Slime is great against targeted removal because you can just flash in and devour whatever was going to get killed, or maybe even devour some extra tokens you have lying around to get a pretty big slime. It can also be good right after somebody board wipes because then we can have something in play by the time our turn comes around. Green Slime is a very powerful card that not many people are going to be expecting. Even if you foretell it, they probably won't know what it is, and it's actually very powerful to be able to counter an activated or triggered ability from an artifact or enchantment. Guardian Gladewalker is a classic in any sort of tribal deck. Being able to fill in the curve and then put a counter on something is excellent. Inexorable Blob is really good if you can meet its condition, which shouldn't be too hard to meet seeing as we're running quite a few sorceries and creatures. We even have a couple of planeswalkers in there, so it should be okay. Manaplasm is a card that I actually really like back from my days in Alara. If you play this early and jam some spells, it can swing for a lot of damage every turn. Masked Vandal is another classic card for any sort of tribal deck that's actually going to be very good by removing an artifact or enchantment permanently. Mitotic Slime is a very powerful card in the deck because it eventually provides 7 different Oozes, which is super strong for one card. Nylea, God of the Hunt, is there to make sure our Oozes get through when they're getting very big in the late game. Oka Jelly is a really annoying one which can keep surviving big as long as it has enough counters on it, and since it has trample, it can't really be ignored. Since we're putting a lot of counters on creatures in this deck, it's very easy to keep this alive permanently. Orange Reef Ooze can start the ball rolling by putting a counter on one of your creatures, and then it's going to make all of your creatures with counters on them get an extra counter when it attacks. Predator Ooze is really annoying by being indestructible. It's going to get bigger and bigger, and then it's going to start getting extra counters when it starts killing stuff. Primal Crux is an absolute pet card of mine. You can definitely swap it out for another slime against humanity, but I just love how big this guy can get. Brit Lifter Ooze is incredibly good in the deck, even though when running no other face down cards. Just by itself, this gives us two different oozes, one of which has Death Touch, and the other one is going to be quite big and have trample, so this is excellent. Ravenous Slime is a card that I think is very underrated in Commander. It can see more play in general in a lot of different decks. It provides some incidental graveyard hate whilst growing itself, and is also often quite difficult to block profitably. Realm Walker is going to provide us a little bit of card advantage whilst also counting as an ooze. Regal Force is going to come into play and draw us an absolute boatload of cards since we're running basically only green creatures. Runati Behemoth Caller is in the deck because it synergizes very well with our counters theme, and particularly with our commander. It's going to give Aeve and all its copies an additional counter when they come into play, so as long as they have just 2 more counters, they can attack immediately, which is very strong. Sakura Tribe Elder is just some decent ramp. Scavenging Ooze is a card that again used to see a ton of play in Commander but has fallen out of favor. However, in this deck it fits perfectly. Slurk All Ingesting works very well with Runati, but also it just synergizes so well with the theme of the deck, seeing as pretty much all of our oozes get counters put on them. Splitting Slime is a bit expensive to use Monstrosity on, but it's still nice to have that option. Surrican Goreclaw is another great way to give our creatures haste, which can make sure we win the game, particularly with our 1 combo piece which we have in the deck. Tangled Florahedron is just some more ramp, and Voyaging Satyr is a card that I recommend in most mono green decks because it synergizes so well with Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Moving on to sorceries, we have Gelatinous Genesis, which grows exponentially and makes more and more oozes depending on how much mana you sink into it. Fishkar's Expertise should draw us a lot of cards, seeing as our creatures are getting very big in this deck. Shamanic Revelation should also draw us a lot of cards, seeing as we're going quite wide in this deck, and it can also gain us quite a bit of life because we are getting a lot of counters on our creatures. Then of course we're running 8 Slime against Humanity, which is one of the main things in this deck. The first one's usually not going to be that great, but later on in the game when your graveyard is full of oozes and other slimes against Humanity, this can actually make really big creatures. For instance, we're running Heroic Intervention and Rapid Vigor as ways to protect against board wipes. Nature's Claim is very good removal that only costs 1 mana, which means that it's good to chain into our commander for storm count. And Return of the Wild Speaker is great to try to finish the game by either drawing us a bunch of cards or boosting all of our board. For artifacts, we're running Obelisk of Erd. We're going wide, so it should be easy to convoke this out and buff all of our oozes. And the Great Henge, as usual, does almost everything in this deck. It's going to draw us a bunch of cards, gain us some life, and put counters on our creatures. Finally, for enchantments, we're running Food Chain. I don't usually put infinite combos in my decks, but I have this time, and that's because I do think we need one way to close out the game that just happens naturally. We're not tutoring for it. So the way it works is Food Chain is going to exile Aeve and any copies of Aeve, and then because every time we cast him, we're getting extra copies, those can be exiled to Food Chain for more or more mana. And each time we're getting net mana, which results in infinite Aves. So all we need is somewhere to draw cards, such as the Great Henge or Beast Whisperer, and then we'll eventually draw into one of our haste enablers that should win us the game. Greater Good is great. As a way to refill our hand, we get to sacrifice any of our big creatures and draw a bunch of cards. Gutter Grime is actually very nice because it's going to give us triggers whenever one of our creatures dies, which means we get a steady stream of oozes. Ooze Flux can be very powerful, particularly when you realize that it can be done at instant speed. This can provide another very steady stream of oozes. And Tribute to the World Tree is mostly going to be putting counters on creatures in this deck, seeing as most of them don't have natural power 3 or greater, but it's still nice to buff all of our creatures. For Planeswalkers, we have Garruk Primal Hunter, which is there to either draw us cards or make us some tokens. And Nissa Ascended Animist is very flexible because it can either make a huge token or destroy an artifact or enchantment, which are both very welcome, but then it can also just win you the game on the spot by giving all of your creatures a huge overrun effect. Finally, moving on to lands, we have Bonder's Enclave, which is a great way to draw some extra cards in this deck. Mosswood Bridge should be very easy to trigger and cast something big for cheap. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is going to add so much mana because we are playing a very mana intensive mono green deck. Oran Reef the Vastwood is going to buff all of our creatures and make them really chunky. Rogue's Passage can sometimes win the game out of nowhere if one of our oozes gets really big, particularly with Chameleon Colossus. And War Room is a great way to draw some extra cards for just a little bit of life. So there you have it. That has been our Aeve Progenitor Ooze deck tech. What do you think about this one? Would you build more of a dedicated Slime Against Humanity deck with 20 or 30 copies of it and Thrumming Stone and all that kind of stuff, let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.